Thanks, Alan. Welcome, everyone. My name is Gladys Rama. I'm the editorial director at redmondmag.com, and I am so pleased to be welcoming you to our summit, Microsoft Security in 2023, brought to you by Ignite, Graphis, and Abnormal Security. The editorial staff of redmondmag.com have worked really hard to bring together some of the best independent experts on this topic for this event, so we really hope that you enjoy it. Before we start with the first of our 3 sessions today, we do have a couple of announcements. First, this event is being recorded and will be available for future viewing, so you'll receive an email from us when the replay is available, generally in the next couple of days. Second, each of today's 3 sessions will be followed by a 5 to 10 minute Q&A, so please be sure to put your questions into the Q&A area of your console as they come up so we can get them answered for you by our experts. Third, during today's 3rd session, we are giving away a high-end home espresso maker, but you must be present to win, so please be sure to stay on for the entire event. And finally, we do have resources from our sponsors, Ignite, Graphis, and Abnormal Security. They're right there on the console for you now, so please download them and check them out when you have the time. It's because of Ignite, Graphis, and Abnormal Security underwriting this content that we can bring you the summit. So we thank them for supporting the summit and supporting the community. And in turn, we ask you to check out those resources so we can bring you more events like this in the future. Now on to the first session of today's summit, Microsoft's 2023 Security Product Roadmap in 50 minutes. This session features Chris Paoli, the editor of redmondmag.com, and Joey D'Antoni, the principal consultant at Denny Cherry and Associates Consulting, and as well as a Microsoft Data Platform MVP and a frequent columnist at redmondmag.com. He writes the Joey on SQL column, super helpful if you're a DBA or just a general IT guy or IT person wanting to stay on top of the latest Microsoft development. So thanks, Chris and Joey, for joining our little roundtable today. I'll be moderating this session. And let's go ahead and get started. First of all, we wanted to present this as kind of a brief recap of Microsoft security messaging in the last quarter or so, and then kind of sketch out for you how that will shape its security roadmap in the coming year. So just a quick recap, and this is all the messaging that was highlighted in Microsoft Ignite, Microsoft Inspire, if you attended those summits, or those conferences rather, or if you listened to our recaps of those events, this will all sound familiar to you. The first, attacks are getting more sophisticated, expensive, and high stakes. Zero trust or bust, basically just go zero trust. That's the, you've heard this from most big tech vendors, but Microsoft particularly. This year in particular, support deadlines are rampant. They are coming at you fast, starting with just this month, and this needs to be the year that your shop migrates to the next available product, or you risk security, missing security patches, opening up yourselves up to vulnerabilities. And finally, security starts with hardware. This is a big piece of Microsoft messaging in Windows 11. So we'll be going over where they are with that in this session. Again, I mentioned Inspire. CEO Satya Nadella was really hammering home the point of the cost of ransomware attacks now. This was a slide from his Inspire keynote, estimating the cost of cybercrime to be $10.5 trillion by the time 2025 rolls around. And he was really urging, Inspire is a Microsoft partner conference, so, and I'm sure a lot of you all in the audience work with partners on your security, managed security services providers. And he's really pushing Microsoft security partners to work on increasing, leveling up everyone's security postures in this coming year. couple of numbers from Inspire. From Nadella's presentation again, the average cost of a breach is $4.2 million, which is really staggering amount when you can consider it's a per breach amount. Supply chain attacks are up 650% year over year compared to, this is from 2022's Inspire, so compared to 2021, which again is a crazy amount. I don't know about you guys, but you, Joey or Chris, but 650% year over year.
Yeah, I mean, I think some of that's starting from a low basis, but those attacks are kind of the most dangerous kind of attacks because, like, you're talking about stuff you're going to be deploying to your servers. So, yeah.
Right. We'll be curious to see what the number is at the end of 2023. And there are 921 password attacks per second. Of course, Microsoft monitors this. They have a lot of I forget what the name of the service is, but
telemetry.
Yes, and they track this in-house. They share it with their customers and their partners. So, I mean, these are pretty staggering numbers. It's helpful to see it in a slide presented straight from Nadella's presentation. And then, you know, a lot of this was borne out in 2022 with the pace of ransomware attacks, a lot of really highly publicized ones. Chris, you wrote, or Kurt, our other editor, Redmond Mag, wrote this story that most organizations have been hit by ransomware. And by most, you're like 5 out of 10, 6 out of 10. Chris, exactly what is the number that this study was pointing to when they say most?
Yeah, sure. Hey, good morning, everyone. Yeah, it's a lot. According to the survey by Enterprise Strategy Group, 79% of respondents said they had experienced some sort of ransomware attack in the previous 12 months. So, yeah, that's a crazy amount. It's no surprise to see what were the top entry points for the ransomware incursions. It was 36% said it came from application software vulnerabilities, and 33% came from system software vulnerabilities. Just another reminder to stay on top of patching, everyone.
All right. Joey, you work with clients. Does that bear out with what you're seeing from the people that you've spoken to?
I think I've seen a lower percentage of that with my clients, but like to speak to the cost that you had on the previous slide, that's something I've definitely seen for sure. Because I mean, a lot of the organizations that get hit badly, that get impacted when they have a ransomware attack, don't have a lot of those mitigations like zero trust in place. So it effectively takes their entire business down.
Right.
And like that's the attacks are one thing, but the mitigations you have in place, you know, can limit some of the impact, and that's why we harp on them so much.
Right. Good to know. So obviously SMBs are particularly high risk because they don't have their in-house. They don't necessarily have an in-house IT staff to do all their security monitoring for them. But a pretty notable attack late last year was the LA Unified Schools District, which is the second largest in the country. Right? It serves over 600,000 students. Excuse me. So it's pretty notable for its size. They had the FBI involved. They had government agencies involved trying to mitigate this. So I think it kind of speaks to the extent that ransomware attacks have really permeated the enterprise IT landscape. It isn't just, one-person, two-person shops. It's not just SMBs that, again, maybe don't have the in-house IT skills. It's big agencies as well. It's government agencies. I'm sure you've heard of government agencies getting hit with ransomware attacks. And this is, I think, what Microsoft was really, and Nadella in particular, in those slides from Inspire, was really trying to hammer home that security is a problem for everybody. And Joey, I really wanted to pick your brain on this one. This, I think, is a really high-profile one that a lot of people have seen and heard about. Rackspace is a major Microsoft partner. It's a major MSP. It's got thousands of customers. And late last year, it had a pretty high-profile ransomware attack on its hosted Exchange service. And then, Joey, you wrote this great article for Redmond. See if I can get that up here. Basically, the anatomy of the Rackspace ransomware incident. Can you give us some background on this? What exactly happened?
Yeah, full disclosure here. I have done some work with Rackspace in the past. They were an indirect client of mine, and I kind of taught some of their staff Azure. But what happened with this incident kind of speaks to a lot of what you've been talking about so far, Gladys. There were a number of things, and I kind of addressed this in the article, but I tend to hold, even though Rackspace isn't at the level of AWS, Azure, or Google Cloud, I tend to hold them at kind of a similar level because they're a service provider and they're providing services to a lot of businesses. I think it was several thousand, if I'm remembering correctly, that were impacted by this. And they had really bad security hygiene in this environment. They were running Exchange 2013, which is still supported, but I think going off support this year. But it wasn't up to date for the latest patches. They never actually officially stated that, but some security researchers had identified that. I don't think they had a real backup strategy. I directly quoted their chief product officer in the story, and he said something to the effect of, when I asked, "Do you have backups of the environment?" He said something to the effect of like, "We have our Exchange in a distributed database availability group environment, which means you have multiple copies spread across a single cluster. But that's not really the same as having backups like that you can fall back to." And so I don't think they had backups, and they effectively had all of their as far as I can tell, they also had all of their customers in like one cluster. So all sorts of really bad. And I kind of, in that article, I talked about the nature of like the way you manage those multi-tenant environments. So it was just bad on bad on bad. And they were vulnerable, and when they got hit, it took everybody down.
Right.
Yeah, just to step back a little bit as to what the threat landscape looks like. I had the opportunity to attend a security conference in D.C. In November, and the level of sophistication of the threats from the threat actors is very impressive. Like how tightly they can personalize messages, like using stuff like LinkedIn profiles. It's really kind of incredible how good they are at sending attacks.
Right. We just have a comment here from Andrew King about what you just said right now, Joey, about Rackspace not having the kind of backup infrastructure that you would expect them to have. Andrew says, "I've worked a lot at DFIR, and I've never seen backups materially impact the recovery efforts in an enterprise-wide ransomware event."
It depends. There's a lot of it depends there. If the backups can be immutable and offline and be able to be restored quickly, and you understand when the ransomware hit, it's important. I mean, it can help. The issue tends to be, I think, and this is probably speaking to what Andrew said, a lot of times the way these ransomware attacks work is when they infect your environment, the attack doesn't take place, right? So they'll sit idle for a week or a month, or I haven't heard of longer than a month, but I'm sure it's possible.
Right.
And the software will sit idle and then attack. So you really don't know how long you don't know when your backup is acceptable.
Right. I think you basically answered my question here about what it says in the state of Microsoft enterprise security. The thing that kind of gets me with this is that Rackspace is a major partner. Of course, I think it's best practice for an organization to assess their partners, vet their partners, whoever they partner with, especially if it's a managed security service. But then you have a huge player like Rackspace. I think the temptation is to say, well, they have these laurels, they have a great reputation, they have a huge customer base. We can, rest a little easy. And, it kind of speaks to you always have to be prepared, and we're going to be talking about zero trust later on. Chris, I want to pivot to you right now because a lot of this is recaps, right? Like this is the Rackspace event happened late last year. What is Microsoft doing for the future, like in this, to speak to its roadmap, which is the topic of our session here? What is Microsoft working on to kind of address and help organizations mitigate these kinds of threats?
Yeah, they're focusing on it quite a bit. It's been a pretty significant area of work for them, especially over the last 12 months. Here's a couple of recent examples. Microsoft first started rolling out a new default security feature setting in Windows 11 last year that by default will lock down an account if an attempt is made by a remote desktop protocol attack or a brute force password action. While the feature isn't technically new, the latest update turned on the feature automatically as default. Microsoft said that even though the feature, which can be found in Windows 10, Server, and 11, has been around for a while, the company was not seeing enterprises taking advantage of it. So now IT won't have to worry about whether it's on or not. It will be automatically. I think a lot of it is just letting their customers know that the solutions are in place, but it's up to them. It's up to IT to actually use them. Like using conditional access policies in the Azure Active Directory and taking advantage of Microsoft Defender for Identity, which was formerly called Azure Advanced Threat Protection. Other ways that IT can safeguard their environments is with the use of Microsoft Information Protection for device data protection and Microsoft Sentinel to monitor a network for potential threats. I think Microsoft's main point recently is that it's going to take more than one security tool to get the job done, but it feels confident enough that it has those tools in place. It's just letting the consumer know that they're there and letting their customers know how to access them and how to actively deploy them across their environment.
Right. It's kind of, so is that the Windows 11 brute force, that default setting, that's now available, right? I just want to.
Yeah, correct. It was in testing for a bit in Windows 11, the most recent test version, but I believe now it's been rolled out across Windows 11. I have not seen if it doesn't look like it's on by default yet in Windows 10 or Windows Server products.
Okay. But definitely for Windows 11.
Chris, that's not, like, to me, that sounds like one of those features that's not hardware dependent with Windows 11 security. I know there are a couple of things that are, but I would imagine that one's not, right?
Correct.
Great. And yes, and we are definitely talking about Windows 11 hardware security in a couple of slides now. Let's see here. Moving on, Zero Trust, which is the new it girl for enterprise IT security, and certainly Microsoft has been championing it for a good couple of years now. And I mean, in layman's terms, and Joey, Chris, please correct me if I'm wrong, but everyone on this call who is listening has heard this same mantra over and over again. But it's basically assume an attack is imminent or is already happening and act accordingly. So it's like when they tell us Californians, when we're trying to get our license, to drive defensively, this is the drive defensively of enterprise IT security. That's my understanding of Zero Trust.
A friend of mine had this really awesome description, and I can never remember what she said, but it was like authenticate everywhere, every time, basically.
Yes.
Yeah.
Everything everywhere.
Yeah. This is one of those things that's really great, and it makes a lot of sense until you go to implement it, especially in a larger organization with a lot of legacy applications that, probably need too many permissions to work correctly, and that's the real challenge there. Right.
So this is interesting because Microsoft has been talking about passwordless for at least the last couple of years, even as it advocates for multi-factor authentication, which you would think those are two things that maybe there's a little bit of friction between those two things, going passwordless, but also double up on your password or password type authentications. Joey, you wrote an article actually right around the time of Ignite, and its title is "It's Time to Go Passwordless. Here's How." So I'm turning to you as the passwordless champion of redmondmag.com and asking, so how and why does passwordless go hand in hand with zero trust? And is this even, what would this look like for an organization? Is this even feasible for most of the organizations that might be on this call?
So passwordless auth for users, I think, is very feasible, especially if you're on newer devices. The easiest way to go passwordless with Windows is using Windows Hello, and that uses facial recognition to authenticate you. That facial recognition data is stored on the hardware on a trusted security module in the hardware, and that's what authenticates you. The other option there that you can use is YubiKey. YubiKey is a hardware device. It's got a pin tied to it. The particular hardware device I use for authenticating into my Windows virtual machine has a fingerprint reader, so I authenticate with my fingerprint. In some cases, not for authenticating into Windows, but for authenticating into Azure Active Directory, I can authenticate with either my fingerprint or a PIN. So those are just some of the options. Where it gets harder is not all, and this ties back to the whole legacy thing. That works great. You're on Windows 10, you're on Windows 11. It's very easy to implement. It's like one switch in Azure Active Directory to make it work. But if you're once you're in that Windows OS, you have other applications. So you have and I haven't logged in SAP in forever, but I don't know if SAP supports that kind of authentication, or if you have to, still log in with a username and password, and that's where that tends to run into trouble.
Right. Do you know how Microsoft is planning to adjust or update its identity product when it comes to zero trust and passwordless? I mean, that's kind of a vague question, but you know how Active Directory and Entra, which is the new umbrella family category for Microsoft identity products, they obviously feature very heavily in Microsoft's zero trust vision. How are they equipping these products to make it easier for companies to go zero trust and go passwordless if they have to?
I think you got the product name wrong. It's like the official product name is Entra, supporting Azure. It's the product name's ridiculous, but it's easy to make fun of Microsoft product names.
That can be a whole other summit.
Azure Active Directory has got a lot of really cool stuff built into it. It's kind of like a more modern version of traditional Windows Server Active Directory. There are so many features, right, that are built on top of it. So like conditional access, privileged identity management, identity protection, all those things are kind of built on top of you using an identity that's assumed to be used in Azure Active Directory. The other thing I'll say around Azure Active Directory, I think that makes it compelling and does help with your zero trust, is there are something like 6,000 applications in the Azure Active Directory marketplace that support authenticating with your same credentials and using that Azure Active Directory backbone as an authentication and identity governance provider. So they're in building an open standard for application developers to develop to. They've done a really good job of building a super compelling single sign-on product. And interestingly, their competition in the space is like Okta and probably Duo, not per se Amazon, who tends to depend on third parties like Okta and Duo to provide that sort of functionality. So I kind of lean towards saying Microsoft's the market leader in the space just because of the breadth of what they have, and they've built a really robust set of tools here.
Right. And Chris, do you have any insight into other zero trust related passwordless MFA updates that Microsoft is working on for its products on top of what Joey had just mentioned?
Yeah, we can run through a few from the previous months. Last year, Microsoft discussed that it's bringing FIDO, its industry standards for devices that permit PINs, cards, key fobs, et cetera, to Windows 365. It's already available, like Joey said, on Windows Hello, but the company is planning to expand it to Windows 365 and hopefully to other parts of its portfolio. It also launched a preview of Windows Hello for Business Cloud Trust for use with the Windows 11 and Windows 10 deployment model that uses Azure Active Directory Kubernetes instead of public key infrastructure in an attempt to simplify key management and distribution. Finally, Azure Active Directory Conditional Access Service received a new control called Authentication Strength in the later part of last year, which lets IT pros specify which methods of multi-factor authentication can be used when accessing network resources. You've been either able to turn it on or off MFA in the past. This is just one new step that actually lets you choose what kind of ways you're allowing your users to authenticate. So it gives IT a lot more flexibility for sure.
Yeah, and the notion of that, and I was happy that came out. It was something I had emailed the PM about, and she's like, actually, yeah, that's in private preview. Is that like you can conditional access to say if a login is considered medium or high risk, because Microsoft identifies the risk level of the login using all that fancy telemetry stuff we were talking about, you can then force them to like authenticate with a higher method. So like a YubiKey.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Yeah, that's super handy. Real quick, before we move on to the next session, which is going to be a bear, it's about support deadlines. Before we move on, I wanted to bring up this comment from Richard. I think he's referring to, and Richard, please correct me if I'm wrong, I think he's talking about the steps that customers need to take when they're working with or vetting with Microsoft security partners. Richard says they need to read their SLA and verify that they offer what you need for backups and restores. Which sounds like homework, Richard, but obviously it is critical that you need to go over the fine print, read everything that they offer for backups and restores. I think the reason people don't tend to do that is because they assume that there are very few material differences between one managed security services provider and then the next one when it comes to backups and restores, because you think, well, how different can they be? So yeah, it's a good pointer.
The two key things to ask there are about immutability and air gapping. Immutability means write once, you can never update it again, and then air gapping means is it disconnected from their main network, so that like if something gets attacked, the backups are still safe.
Yeah, great reminder. So thanks for that, Richard. Next, we're moving on to, as promised, the kind of the big elephant in the room is that 2023 is going to mean that the end of support for a lot of Microsoft just a lot of Microsoft products in general. And a lot of these, they're a little bit esoteric. They're not in use as much because they are older. But there's some big ticket items on this list. And obviously, if no support means no patches. There are options, of course. If you wanted to pay exorbitant fees, you could sign up for an extended security update package from Microsoft. They don't actually publicize how much these cost, so which makes me, like when you go to a restaurant and you look at the menu and there's no cost, there's no price next to the burger, I feel like that should be a sign that it's going to be a very expensive burger. As far as I can tell, Joey or Chris, please correct me if I'm wrong, Microsoft doesn't publicize the ESU costs for the products that they offer ESUs for. You have to call them directly. But from my understanding from speaking with partners is that they go up high, they become more expensive the more years that you need it. Yeah,
I want to say it's like a 3 or 4 year contract, and there's a pretty big escalator in every year.
Right. So yeah, is it worth it to, or there's reasons why people can't upgrade, obviously, but you'll certainly be paying a price if you do the ESU option, which we just discussed. So there's an exhaustive list of Microsoft products reaching support deadlines in 2023. I'm going to try to rattle these off because I know a lot of people listen to these without looking at the screen. This is a healthy reminder that these slides will be available afterwards. So if you want to double check this list, it'll be available for you. Seth just asked if there's a slide of those products that are end of life. Yes, Seth, you'll get these slides after in a couple of days. So starting Office 2013, Office 2019, Windows Server 2012 and 2012 R2, Hyper-V Server 2012 and R2, Windows Storage Server 2012 and R2, Exchange 2013, Link Server 2013, SharePoint 2013, Skype for Business 2015. That's not a typo. 2015. Why? I don't know. Microsoft knows, but that can be a separate session altogether. The Windows 8.1, the late lamented Windows RT, Windows Embedded 8 Standard, Windows Embedded 8.1 Industry, Windows 10, 20H2, Enterprise and Education. So that's pretty recent. So, a lot of people on this call, maybe not a lot, but at least a couple of you, I think, will have to follow up on that regard. Windows 10, 21H2 Home and Pro, Windows 11, 21H2 Home and Pro. Oh, and that's it. That's the end of the list, guys. Oh, Lord, I have to do this all over again.
That's it?
Pardon me. That's it. So we didn't do something like this last year, but it's a lot. It's a lot. Chris, you saw that list.
Yeah.
Sorry, it's a little chaotic right now. What's the standout to you? Because I off the top of my head, I know that April is a red letter month for a couple of these products. A lot of them are reaching end of life all at the same time in April. Is there a standout to you here?
Yeah, it's actually, so last week, April and October are going to be very busy for some IT pros out there. Last week, we lost support for we lost extended security support for Windows 7 and Windows Server 2008. That's a pretty big deal. Like you mentioned, April is a big month. We're losing Microsoft Office 2013, the whole productivity suite. Office 2013 has had kind of a slow, gradual death. It did lose integration with Microsoft 365 in October of last year. So the writing was already on the wall for that one. Further, April also will lose SQL Server 2008 and SQL Server 2012. I think those are the big ones for April. Jumping up to October, again, big month. We will be losing Windows Server 2012, 2012 R2, Hyper-V Server 2012, and Windows Storage Server 2012. So yeah, it's going to be a busy year for some of you out there, for sure.
Right. And Joey, so, a frequent question that we get is, what is the upgrade path for these Microsoft products? And a lot of the times they are just told, we'll go to the cloud version or, move to the next available. What's your advice for the IT pros on this call for when they're trying to determine the upgrade path?
So the big one I see here for IT pros specifically is the Windows Server 2012 and R2 stuff. Like a lot of that the Windows 10 and 11 stuff, well, it's relatively recent. Those are just patches effectively. It's not like you're having to reinstall. The path is like either do an input, like there's always kind of two paths you can take to this. It's easier if you're in the cloud or have a big virtual environment, right? You can do an in-place upgrade, or you can build a new virtual machine and then just migrate over to it. Typically, that second option is going to have less downtime. Depends on the nature of the applications you're running. We have a lab, and we had a lot of stuff that was 2012 R2, and I went ahead and upgraded, I think, all of it to either 2019 or 2022. And I just did in-place upgrades. So I just mounted the CD and clicked next a few times. It didn't break anything too badly. Don't do that in your production environment. But you can have the option. And one thing that's rather interesting I find about this, Microsoft for the longest time did not support doing in-place upgrades in Azure, which I don't really know why it worked. But recently they have added additional support for that. So if you're running on Azure VMs and you have like 2012 or 2012 R2, that's a little bit challenging, but you can do it. The other thing the other product that would concern me here is a little bit Hyper-V. But one of the things that's been added recently, and unfortunately this will be a little bit of a painful process, in Hyper-V you can, or in Windows Server failover clustering starting in Windows Server 2016, you can have a mixed cluster where you can have some nodes running a newer version of Windows. The issue is you can only go up one version from where you are. So like you would be upgrading from 2012 R2 and adding 2016 nodes, or upgrading those nodes to 2016, which means if you want to get to, say, Windows Server 2022, you're going to have to do that like 3 times, and that's going to be an ugly process. So it might be easier just to build a new cluster and migrate the storage over.
Right. On this slide, we have a question from Colin. He says, any links or gotchas for DCs running 2012 R2?
I specifically did in-place upgrades of our domain controllers just to test it. It worked, but given that domain controllers are also kind of distributed by default, like you have multiple domain controllers and you can add them, I would just build new DCs at whatever OS level you wanted to go to. It's just a much easier solution as long as you have like the capacity and space, but they don't take up that many resources.
Right. And Joey, we talked about this a little bit earlier, but at what point is it worth it for a company to buy into the extended support update program for Microsoft?
The company profile that I've seen that does this is typically financial services organizations, because they tend to have a combination of very heavy regulatory burden and lots of money. Pharmaceutical companies might also fall into that space where they can't just upgrade because of various reasons. I don't remember, and Chris, maybe you can speak to this. I don't remember if you're on 2012 R2 and you're in Azure, if you still have some level of support, or is that also ending in October? They've done that in the past where you can, if you're in Azure, they'll provide a little more support for longer. But yeah, typically it's going to be, because it's really expensive, extended support. So it's going to be where you just can't, and you're willing to pay for that support.
Right. Yeah, Joe, you're right about that. Those running 2012 R2 on Azure do get an additional year. So
okay.
You can, put off the decision for another 12 months, I guess.
Right. Okay, well, that's good to know. It's an option, maybe not the best option, but it is there. I mean, if it's, we're talking about security, so obviously you want those patches, especially if you're in those industries that Microsoft, or that Joey, that you talked about, where it's, pharmaceuticals or financial services. There's a lot of critical private data that you have to protect, a lot of regulatory requirements that you have to meet. So let's see here. Well, there's a lot of questions about the support deadlines, not surprisingly, from Larry. And he says, we are on Server 2012 R2. Is extended support available to volume licensed customers without software assurance? I love licensing questions because there's caveat upon caveat when it comes to Microsoft licensing. But Joey, do you know off the top of your head if there's a extended support available for volume licensing customers without SA?
Don't take my word for this, but I do not think there is. I think you have to have an active support agreement with Microsoft, like either an EA, where you would have SA anyway. I don't think you can just buy it in and of itself.
Right. Let's see, moving along, and we'll come back to these deadline questions at the end of this session. But let's get to hardware level security, because I know that's a big selling point for Windows 11. At Ignite, they had just a dedicated little session with the hardware folks at Microsoft, touting Windows 11 security at the processor level as one of its big key selling points. In addition to, they had made improvements to Intune in terms of managing Windows 11 devices. And Chris, we did this exact summit last year for the Microsoft 2022 security product roadmap, and we talked about Pluton and secured core PCs. And the first Pluton-powered PCs have already launched. They launched in early 2022, I think. So where are we at with these technologies now?
Yeah. I'll give just a quick recap for those that didn't attend our last one. It's been a very slow rollout for Microsoft Pluton chips, which, if you don't know, is the dedicated secure hardware chip on the CPU that can store protected data in an isolated way, helping to protect it from hackers being able to compromise the data it contains. Microsoft said it designed Pluton using the zero trust principle. Basically, it'll be near impossible for intruders to access the information, and despite it being hardware, no need to keep on top of the firmware updates. Pluton's just going to be updated with your Windows update as normal. Pluton can play the part of the TPM chip, which is a requirement for Windows 11. Like I said, it's been a slow start in rollout. I think those two Lenovo laptops are still the only hardware options right now with the Pluton chip. Other manufacturers, including Dell, HP, and Acer, have expressed interest in supporting it, but we really haven't seen it yet. Last year, Microsoft also started stepping up its secure core tech in its Internet of Things and Edge devices. You have a few options: Aaron's SRG gateway, Asus's Intelligent Edge computer, Intel's latest gateway, and Lenovo's ThinkEdge SE30 gateway are now devices that are secure core IoT certified products. Microsoft said that these and other secure core IoT devices are 60% more resilient to malware compared to with non-secured core machines. Hopefully over the next year, we start to see an increase in availability of secure core devices and chips. But I feel like last year, Microsoft was going hard in messaging with the Pluton chip, and by the end of last year, we didn't really hear too much about it. So it sounds like right now it's in the manufacturer's court, whether these things start to actually come on the market.
Now, and that's interesting. Joey, actually, you mentioned to me a couple of days ago when we were talking about this summit that Intel is doing these new Sapphire Rapids chips that will be very heavily focused on confidential computing. Can you talk a little bit about this one? What do we know about them so far?
Yeah, and that kind of ties in the way Chris is saying with the Pluton chip. Like, there's secure areas in those chips, and the main thing they avoid is, or try to avoid, is those kind of attacks. Like the attack vector I've heard is, I think it's called Kerberoasting, where a threat actor will attempt to grab a Kerberos ticket out of memory on a Windows computer, and so it can authenticate to others. Mark Rusinovich, who's the CTO of Azure, was on the launch for the Sapphire Rapids chip with Intel and talking about how Microsoft's going to use these chips in confidential computing. The main use case, I know Microsoft's doing some stuff with like protection, like separation protection in Azure with those confidential computing. It's a specific type of VM SKU. And I know like SQL Server specifically, if you're using always encrypted, there's a newer feature called Secure Enclaves that allows you to do some like more advanced kind of queries against encrypted columns, and that's dependent on that hardware.
Great. Yeah, so we'll keep an eye on this one. Sapphire Rapids are those available now? They're not available right now, right, Joey? They're just been announced.
It was just launched. I never know when hardware is available, so I'm not sure if it's or not.
Right. Now, we would be remiss if we're in a security session and we didn't talk about Microsoft Patch Tuesday, the latest rollout just a couple of days ago. Chris, you cover the security patches from Microsoft regularly. Real quick, what do we need to know about this latest January patch rollout?
Yeah, sure. I think at least for January, the top priority should be an elevation of privilege flaw in the Windows Advanced Local Procedure Call. It affects all supported versions of Windows and the Windows Server, and hopefully, I mean, we're a week plus out of Patch Tuesday. You already have it patched, as Microsoft has already seen attacks in the wild. So this should have been, if if you're on it. This should have been your top priority. There's also a trio of elevation of privilege issues in Exchange Server that will be critical to a lot of you running Exchange servers in your enterprises. I'd say those are probably the two big ticket items for the month.
Great. And then,
I believe that patch was sorry. I believe that patch was pulled back and reissued. There is an issue with like Office icons being deleted, but I think that has been resolved.
Yeah, that is correct. They pulled it down and got it back up, I think, a couple days later. By Friday, the reissued patch was up.
Right. And Chris, this is kind of a low number in terms of Microsoft. I mean, 98, we've seen them roll out patch updates in the 3 digits regularly, especially last year. Are you expecting that kind of volume in the next couple of security patch rollouts?
No, you never really know. I mean, December, we saw 49 flaws. So, I mean, compared to December, it's a massive patch. I think the good news is there was just that one 0-day flaw that was being patched. But like I said, you never know. We could have 20 next month, or we can have 112 next month. You really never know with Microsoft's patching.
Right. And now we're going to pivot to SQL, because we don't really talk a lot about SQL when it comes to Microsoft security. I don't know why, but it just doesn't really come up in these kinds of discussions. They're always the big Office, the server, the Exchange server, SharePoint servers. But SQL 2022 was just released. Joey, you wrote about it for Redmond last November. Can you give us a background on the security updates that we should expect to see on SQL Server 2022? I got a couple of bulleted lists, or a couple of highlights here: Azure AD authentication, ledger tables, server level roles, and Defender for SQL. What's your take?
The big thing here is they're bringing a lot of the security features that have been available in the Azure Platform as a Service offerings to SQL servers running in other clouds, on premises, wherever. So like AD authentication support, that's big because it allows you to have multi-factor authentication in your SQL Server authentication path. That was something that was really basically impossible to have before. You could, maybe have MFA logging into Windows, but to have MFA logging into SQL, that's something that's pretty new. Defender for SQL is something that's been around in Azure for a few years. It had a different name, but everything's kind of getting rebranded under the Defender, the Microsoft Defender brand, and that allows you to look at things like SQL injection attacks, report on anomalous logins, so to catch threat actors and things like that. Since we're short on time, I'll kind of wrap. Ledger tables are kind of using some blockchain-like technology. I hate to get tied up in blockchain, but it's effectively immutable tables that allow you to kind of prove that your data has not been changed. The main use case for that is like companies sharing data with other companies. That's something that's also been in Azure SQL Database. I did a Redmond column on it a while back when it, I think, went GA in SQLDB. And then finally, the kind of big one that is a little bit underrated, there are a lot more built-in server roles into SQL Server. And this will allow organizations who have separation of duties and things like that to better separate those duties.
Right. So you think we have feature parity now between at least when it comes to security, between SQL Server and Azure SQL, or we still have a ways to go there? I know that's been Microsoft's main stated goal with SQL Server versus Azure SQL.
At least on the security side, it's pretty close, but it does require some additional components, right? So you do have to have Azure Arc enabled on your SQL Server if it's on-prem, and if it's an Azure VM, there's some stuff you have to do to enable it to take advantage of some of those features. But it does require a little bit of additional componentry, but I think as far as I can think of, everything else is feature complete across for security.
Right.
Across the platforms.
is there a SQL security feature that you wish they had come out with in 2022, or you're still waiting on?
Not in particular. Like the encryption stuff has been there since 2016. It's kind of continually improved. It's just dependent on application developers to use. The one thing I have griped to the team about, and this is like across all the platforms, is we keep talking about passwordless auth, which I think is really cool. The whatever libraries SQL and Azure SQL are using for AD auth does not support the passwordless auth that things like the Azure portal do. So I have been yelling at the team about that. I didn't have a status on it.
Please, keep yelling at them and let us know what you find. So Philip actually has a good question, and I think it's a great segue to what I was going to ask you and Chris before we open it up to audience questions. Philip says, with all the Exchange Server vulnerabilities in the last 2 years, is Microsoft going to finally release a better management solution for synchronized mail-enabled objects in Office 365? Joey or Chris, have you heard anything about this from Microsoft's end? I know that Exchange Server, I feel like we cover Exchange Server security issues all the time on Regnant consistently. Anything that you've heard from Microsoft to assuage Philip's fears, and I'm sure a lot of people on this call?
I have not heard anything in that space.
Yeah, same. I mean, I think Microsoft first has to, I feel like whenever you see a patch pulled back and then reissued, it's usually something to do with a previous Exchange fix. So I think they just need to do a better job of getting it right the first time. I think that would be a good start.
Right. And, it's early in the year. Ignite has just been announced, but for, Q4, Inspire, Build. I'm hoping that they will be addressing a lot of these fairly recent ransomware attacks and Exchange security attacks in those conferences, because, as is indicated by what Philip said, and a lot of the questions that we always get from readers, is a big issue, and it's a recurring issue. But that's actually a good segue. So, Joey, as we head into the conference season, is there anything that you're hoping that Microsoft is going to announce on the security side this year?
I'm trying to think of any roadmap directions I can think of where that would go. I mean, what I'd love to see is conditional access get, and I doubt this is going to happen, but conditional access made available to all Azure AD users and not just P1, or if in the case of Office 365 or Microsoft 365 E3. There's so much of the key security functionality that you can do that is really dependent on having conditional access, and it frustrates me a little bit that it's a premium feature.
Right. And that's specifically, you're talking about the E3 and E5 licenses compared to the other ones, right?
Correct. Yeah. Or if you're just an Azure user, it's P1. But yeah, that's yeah.
Right. Chris, how about you? What are you hoping to hear from Microsoft this year in terms of security?
Some consistency with their branding would be nice. I don't think we all need another major renaming where we have to learn what component is in what product. So I think, I think consistency would really help in their overall strategy of trying to educate customers that the solutions are there. They just customers just need to access them. It starts with not shuffling the cards every 6 to 12 months like they've been doing.
Right. And for me, there's certain things that, like the Windows 11 feature that you talked about, Chris, where it would stop brute force ransomware attacks. For that to have not been enabled by default, and you have to wait on IT to enable it, assuming that they even know that feature is there, I think this is kind of a combination communication problem as well as a feature problem where it's not enabled by default. That seems like a big a weakness that could have been, it probably could have saved a lot of people a lot of grief from the outset if that had been a default feature. So yeah, it'll be interesting to see what happens in as the year rolls out and Microsoft starts announcing things in earnest, starting with its big conference. Inspire, as I said, is usually in the summer, so we'll probably have a recap for you guys for that one. We'll recap all the big security announcements, same with Ignite and Build. And yeah, any final thoughts, Chris and Joey, before we take a break for the next session?
Use multi-factor authentication everywhere.
Yeah, agreed. And
patch frequently. Yeah, Chris, go ahead.
Oh no, it's just agreed. And if you're on those older products, get ready to put in some work this year.
Right. Right. All right. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Chris and Joey, for a really great roundup of what's been going on in Microsoft security the last couple of quarters and what we can expect in the coming months. Everyone else, stay tuned. We're going to take a very quick break, and we'll be back at the top of the hour for our second session, Top Best Practices for Windows Enterprise Security Heading into 2023, featuring Brian Posey. In the meantime, check out those resources on the console provided by Ignite, Graphis, and Abnormal Security, and we'll be right back.
welcome back to our second session. David, please take it away.
Thanks, Alan. Okay, welcome back, everyone. I'm David Rammel, editor of Virtualization Cloud Review, thanking you for attending the summit and thanking our sponsors, Ignite, Graphus, and Abnormal Security, for underwriting it and allowing us to bring you this great content. I'm moderating the second session of our summit called Top Best Practices for Windows Enterprise Security Heading into 2023. Our speaker for this session is Brian Posey, a 21-time Microsoft MVP, freelance tech author, and commercial astronaut candidate. Throughout Brian's career, he has written or contributed to dozens of IT books and created numerous full-length video training courses and published thousands of blog posts on a huge variety of IT and space-related topics. Many of those blog posts can be found in his Posey's Tips and Tricks column or in his new Posey's Moonshot column. Brian, it's great to have you here. Please take it away.
Hey, thank you so much for having me, and it's great to be back. Took a little break for a couple of months, so this is the first webcast that I've gotten to do since November, so I am really excited to be back and doing this sort of thing. So anyway, today I'm going to be talking about the top 10 security best practices for Windows. Now, one of the things that I need to be sure and point out before I really get into this is that Microsoft does not provide a top 10 list of security best practices for Windows. It just doesn't exist. In reality, there are way, way more than 10 best practices. So what I did for this particular presentation was I tried to find the things that were the most actionable, the things that would be the most beneficial to people that were looking to secure their Windows environments. And even though some of the things that I'm going to be talking about are common knowledge, there's going to be hopefully some things related to each one of the best practices that I'm talking about that maybe you haven't heard before. Now, a lot of these best practices stemmed from the article that I've linked to on the slide. I'm not taking this stuff out of the article and using it verbatim. I've put my own twist on every single one of these, but a lot of the ideas from the best practices came from this particular article. And the reason why I mention that is because as I was reading over this, I thought this was really well written and it had a lot of good advice. So it may be something that you want to go and check out after this presentation is over. So having said that, let's go ahead and get into the best practices. Now, best practice number one, treat pass the hash as a serious threat. Now, maybe treat pass the hash as a serious threat isn't so much of a best practice in and of itself as the actions that you would take to counter a pass the hash attack might be better regarded as the best practices. So what do I mean by that? Well, a pass the hash attack is one of the more common and one of the more serious attacks that's often made against Windows environments. And I want to spend a little bit of time up front talking about why pass the hash attacks can happen and some of the mechanisms that are at work behind that, because some of the things that I'm going to go into in this discussion become relevant later on as I get into some of the other best practices. So what is a pass the hash attack? Well, the idea being that every Windows machine out there has its own security accounts manager database. Take a Windows 10 machine or a Windows 7 or Windows 11 or whatever flavor of Windows you happen to be working with at the desktop. It's got its own built-in security database. You can create local security accounts on that machine. However, local security accounts aren't the only types of accounts that can be used. As I'm sure everyone on this call knows, you can also log into a domain. But when you log into a domain, what happens is that at the time of login, an account is created on that local machine matching the account that you logged in to the domain with. So if, for example, you were to log in as a domain admin, well, a domain admin account is going to be created on that machine. So why does this happen? Well, there are a few different reasons for it, but one of the big ones is because of the need for cached credentials. Let me explain. Let's suppose for a moment that you've got a small Windows network and you've got one domain controller. I know best practices are that you should always have more than that, but let's say that you've got a really, really small business and you've only got one domain controller, and for whatever reason that domain controller goes down. So at that point, you need to be able to log in order to fix that domain controller. The problem is the domain controller is what processes the logins, so you've kind of got this whole chicken and the egg situation. You need to be able to log in, but there is no mechanism for logging in. Well, that's where those local accounts come into play. Because assuming that you've logged on to one of those machines as a domain admin in the past, you've got a cached account on that machine, so you would have a way of logging in, using that cached account to get in and fix what needs to be fixed. That's why Microsoft set this up the way that it is in the first place. The problem with that is that it opens the door for pass-the-hash attacks. Now, pass-the-hash attacks, for anybody who's not familiar with the concept, is a type of elevation of privileges attack. The idea is that anybody who has access to a particular workstation on a Windows network can extract that security accounts database. And what they do is they go through the list of accounts that have logged on to that machine previously, and they look for something that has elevated privileges. So in other words, not just a standard user, but an admin or a delegated admin, somebody who has some level of added privileges. So if they don't find what they're looking for, then they simply move on to the next workstation, and they search that one. If they don't find what they're looking for there, they move on to the next one, and they keep searching the security accounts database on each one of these workstations in sequence until they eventually find an account that has elevated permissions. And once they've got that, well, then they can use that to log into the domain as an administrator, and at that point, they more or less own your network. So that's what a pass-the-hash attack is based on. There's a little bit more to it than that, but that's kind of the Reader's Digest version, so to speak. So how do you prevent that? Well, the best way of preventing it is to make sure that nobody ever logs on to any of the workstations on your network using an account that has elevated privileges. So the best practice here is just to make sure that you only do administrative work from designated administrative machines. So in other words, have machines that you've set aside, be they physical or virtual, it doesn't really matter, but just make sure that those machines are used only for administrative purposes and that you never perform administrative tasks from anywhere else. So that way there's no danger of someone being able to gather your administrative credentials off of a workstation that you've used for administrative practices. And just as a way of giving yourself a little bit of extra security, it's a good idea to make sure that the workstations that you use for administrative purposes are joined to a completely separate domain from all of your normal production workstations. That won't completely prevent a pass-the-hash attack. There are ways of getting around that, but it makes things just a little bit more difficult on the attacker. So it helps give you a little bit better security. So what else can you do? Well, another best practice related to this is to use dedicated admin accounts, but not the built-in domain administrator account. So why would you do that? Well, again, there are several different reasons, but the reason why I recommend this and why Microsoft so often recommends this is simply for the purpose of accountability. It makes auditing and logging just a little bit easier. And there are practical implications for that as well. Years and years ago, I worked for a large insurance company. And, you know, sometimes you hear stories about a rogue administrator. At this company, there actually was one. And the problem was that the person who was in charge of the IT department at the time really didn't know much about IT. And they were perfectly content with using a built-in admin account. It wasn't actually called an administrator because this predates Windows, but they were perfectly comfortable with using just a built-in account for all administrative activity. So this one account was shared by all of the administrators who worked for this particular IT department. Well, we had one rogue administrator who was always doing bad things. And because everybody used the same administrative account, it was impossible for the longest time to prove who it was that was going out and doing these bad things. Giving everybody a dedicated account just helps the logging process. It makes it a lot easier to identify which account was used in doing various administrative activities, be they good or bad. So that can help you a lot with your compliance initiatives. And if something does happen, it can help to identify a rogue administrator, or if you don't have a rogue administrator, it can help you to identify a compromised account. So use dedicated admin accounts, but don't use the built-in domain admin account. Another thing that is worth doing is to use the principles of zero trust and role-based access control. So in other words, in most organizations, really, really small organizations being the notable exception, but in most organizations, you don't want to grant blanket administrative privileges to anybody because doing that is dangerous, not just from a compliance standpoint, but also from the standpoint of if that account were to become compromised or if that particular administrator were to accidentally trigger a ransomware infection, well then whatever that account has access to, that's what the ransomware or the attacker is going to inherit. So you want to limit those administrative privileges through role-based access control. Now, having said that, one thing that I would recommend at least considering, it's kind of a pain, but it's worth at least considering, is taking things one step further. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, what a lot of organizations will do is they'll set up a standard account and an administrative account for each individual administrator. So in my case, let's say I worked for a particular company. I might have an account called Brian Standard, which is just my standard user account that I would use to check my email or browse the web or what have you. And I might have a separate account called Brian Admin that I would use from that dedicated workstation to perform administrative activities. Well, what you can do is you can take things one step further. And rather than having one admin account per administrative user, you can have several admin accounts that are each dedicated to a specific task. So, for example, let me move to the next slide here. Rather than just having Brian Standard and Brian Admin, you might have Brian Standard, Brian Network Admin, Brian Exchange Admin, Brian Group Policy Admin, and things like that. So you've got a separate account for each individual task. So what does that do for you? Well, for one thing, it really limits the blast radius if one of these accounts happens to be compromised. So that's definitely a good thing to have. And that's the most important thing. Now, admittedly, this is a pain because you have all of these separate accounts and you've got different passwords for each one, hopefully. And so there are a lot of passwords to remember. But another important thing that this does is it helps to prevent the accumulation of privileges. So let's say, for example, and I'm just kind of pulling things from the top of my head here. Let's say you've got a particular administrator who needs Exchange admin permissions and Group Policy admin permissions. If you assign both of those sets of permissions to one account, there's a chance that there could be permissions that are accidentally inherited because of the two types of admin permissions that are assigned to that account. For example, the Group Policy admin permissions might elevate what the Exchange administrator can do. They might be able to do more than they would ordinarily be able to do. And I'm not saying that this is the case in every situation, certainly not for the situation that I just made up off of the top of my head, but you do have to watch out for those unintended elevations of privileges. And this technique that I just described with having multiple administrative accounts for each user will help you to avoid those unintended elevations or accumulations, rather, of privileges. Now, obviously, this is super inconvenient. So rather than doing that, an alternative that you can do is to use just-in-time administration. So the way that works is that you get ready to perform an administrative activity, and your account doesn't have any administrative privileges associated with it. So you actually have to request the permissions that are associated with that activity that you're about to perform. And then Windows Server will grant you those permissions for a certain amount of time. Like it might say, okay, you have permission to reset passwords for the next 4 minutes or something like that. Then those privileges expire and you're back to being a standard user. So that's one way that you can get around all of the tediousness of having to deal with multiple accounts. So best practice number 2, lock down the built-in administrative account. So what do I mean by that? Well, ideally, the domain admin account should only be used in a dire emergency. Any other time, you should be using those dedicated accounts that are assigned to each individual administrator. But I'm also a big believer in having break glass accounts. You can have one break glass account. Personally, I recommend having at least 2. The idea behind a break glass account is that you create an account that has access to absolutely everything. You assign that account the most secure password imaginable, and then you lock that password away in a vault, never ever to be used, hopefully. So that way, if something goes horribly wrong on your network and there's no other way to fix it, you can fish that password out of the vault, sign into the break glass account, and fix the problem. Now, can you do the same thing with the built-in administrator account or domain admin account, rather? Absolutely. Yes, you can. But remember what I talked about earlier about your audit logging and being able to keep track of who did what actions. It's a lot better to have the break glass account show up in your audit logs than having the built-in administrator account, because if you're going back and you're looking at those logs at a later time, you can identify that more easily. You can say, okay, this is when we were having that problem and we had to get out the break glass account. Here's where that break glass account was being used. If, on the other hand, you were to fix the problem using the domain admin account, it becomes just a little bit harder, simply because the domain admin account is a really well-known account and it's a favorite target of cyber criminals. So it becomes a little bit tougher to prove, okay, was this an administrative action performed by me or my staff, or has somebody stolen the credentials for the built-in domain admin account? Now, when it comes to the domain admin account and the built-in administrator account that exists on your Windows desktops both need to be locked down to the greatest extent possible. At the very least, this means using a really long, complicated password for both. But the similarities in how you should deal with those accounts in there. You have to treat the domain admin account a little bit differently from the admin account that's built into Windows desktops. So how so? Well, the domain admin account isn't something that you can disable. That needs to be left enabled just for Windows to be able to function properly. And honestly, I'm not even sure if you can disable it. I haven't tried that in years and years. I don't know if it can be done or not. But one of the things that you should do is go into Active Directory Users and Computers, or you can use the Windows Admin Center, of course. Right-click on the domain admin account, go to Properties, and you'll come to a screen like this. And if you look at the Account tab, which you can see on the slide, you've got all of these account options that you can apply to this account. And one of the options that you should always enable for this particular account is the one that says account is sensitive and cannot be delegated. So that way you prevent anyone from delegating the domain admin account to any of the other accounts in your organization. Now, another option that you might consider selecting is the Enable Smart Card option. Now, you have to consider the implications of doing this, because if your organization uses smart cards, then requiring the smart card option, that's kind of a no-brainer. That should absolutely be done. If your organization doesn't use smart cards, then requiring a smart card is essentially the same as completely disabling that account, which may be a good thing or it may be a bad thing. So you really have to stop and think about that one before you do it. Now, there are also some things that you can do in group policy with regard to the domain admin account. So what you would do is you would go to Computer Configuration, Windows Settings, Security Settings, Local Policies, and User Right Assignment. And there are any number of different policy settings that you can enable with regard to the domain admin account. And I've listed a few of them here. There are actually several others that you might be able to use. The ones on the slide are deny access to this computer from the network, so that way you prevent anyone from logging on across the network using your domain admin account trying to access the machines on your network. Deny logon as batch job. Now, this is one of those things that's not very well documented, and I actually had to do quite a bit of research just to figure out what this one even did. I'll admit it. But what the deny logon as batch job does is it prevents anyone from being able to use the domain admin account to use the Windows Task Scheduler to set up a scheduled job. Another setting that you can enable is deny logon as a service, so you prevent anyone from using the domain admin account to run a system service. This is another one that you have to be careful about, particularly if your network has been around for a long time, because there was a period of time, maybe, 20 years ago or something like that, when it was fairly common to use the built-in domain admin account as a service account. So if that was done long ago and you're still using whatever it was that depended on that service account, then enabling this setting could end up breaking that application. Deny logon through RDP. So enabling that prevents someone from using the remote desktop protocol to log in to your network using the domain admin account. And as I said, there are other settings. Now, if you look at the location and group policy, these all fall under computer configuration. But even so, all of these settings can be applied to the domain admin account. So let me show you how that works. So here we have the group policy console, and you can see that I've gone through computer configuration policies, Windows settings, security settings, local policies, user right assignments, and then here are all of those settings in the middle pane on the screen that I listed on the previous slide. So what I did was I clicked on one of those, and if you look on the right side of the screen, you can see that there's a checkbox that you can select to enable those policy settings. Now below that, where the bottom blue arrow is, there's a button Add User or Group. So even though this is a computer level setting, what you're effectively doing is you're applying that setting to one or more user accounts or groups. So this is where you would click Add User or Group, and you would add your domain admin account. Now, as I mentioned, you have to handle the domain admin account a little bit differently from the local administrator account that exists on Windows desktops. Now, whereas you can't really get away with disabling the domain admin account on Windows Server, you can disable the built-in administrator account on your Windows desktops because that account typically isn't going to be needed, and it's also one of those things that has a very well-documented SID, or a security identifier. So it's something that attackers are well aware of, and it's something that they look for. So going ahead and disabling that local administrator account will definitely help you to improve your security. So best practice number 3, and this ties into the first 2 that I've talked about, is to think about how you're going to manage domain-joined Windows workstations. So there's a bit of a quandary. As you'll recall, I've talked about the importance of disabling administrative access to your desktops, and I've talked about making sure that you're performing all of the administrative tasks from dedicated workstations so that you prevent there from being a administrative account that's been created on a Windows desktop where somebody could launch a pass-the-hash attack. So then the question comes into play, how in the world are you going to manage those Windows desktops if you've put those constraints in place? Well, if a Windows desktop is having problems, then the best thing that you can do is just re-image that desktop. That way there's no need for you to log on to that desktop and create a security risk in the process. Unfortunately, in the real world, that's not always going to solve your problem. There may be situations where you do have to log on to that Windows desktop to do something, or simply re-imaging might not solve every problem. So there's something that you can do in those situations. What you can do is you can use something called Labs. Labs is one of those things that's been around since the days of Windows Server 2003, Service Pack 1, but it's one of those things that I hardly ever hear anybody mention. It's something that you have to go out to Microsoft and download separately. It doesn't come with Windows Server. But Labs stands for the Local Administrator Password Solution. And what it does is it randomizes the password that's associated with the local administrator account so that once Labs has been installed on all of your Windows desktops, every Windows desktop is going to have a different administrator password. And those passwords are stored in the Active Directory. So what this means is that if somebody does manage to access one of your desktops and they get the administrator password, or they simply try to do a pass-the-hash using that password, it doesn't help them because that password is only valid for that one specific machine. So enabling Labs is definitely something that I would recommend doing. And as you can see, you can go out to the Microsoft site. There's a simple download link. And Labs is really, really easy to install on your Windows desktops. So best practice number 4, reassess your audit policy, especially on older networks. Now, there's a reason for this. At one time, when it came to auditing, Microsoft had a very different set of best practices than what they have today. Because at one time, the recommended best practice could best be described as less is more. Microsoft recommended at one time simply enabling the audit policy settings that were going to make the most difference on your network, the audit policy settings that were the most crucial, the ones that would yield the most valuable information in the event of an attack. And there were a few different reasons why they did that, but it really boiled down to the technology of the time. Because one, back then when they used to make those recommendations, machines had a very limited capacity. You could create an audit, or you could create an audit policy and it would start creating log entries, and before you know it, you would have filled up your hard drive if you enabled everything. So recommending that you only enable the most important audit settings was designed to help conserve disk space back then. I kid you not, that was actually part of the mentality. The other thing was that audit logs were really, really tough to sift through back then. There weren't automated solutions for looking for log entries. So you would have to parse these audit logs containing thousands and thousands of log entries manually by hand. And it became really impractical if you logged anything beyond just the bare necessities. So the first several Windows certification courses that I took back in the day actually made those recommendations. Now, over time, of course, machines became a lot more powerful and logging best practices changed. But the problem is that a lot of the networks that we use today use Active Directory environments that are legacy in nature. So even though they might be running a current version of Windows Server, they can trace the roots all the way back to Windows Server 2003 or maybe even Windows NT or Windows 2000 or something really, really old. Now, the reason why that matters is because let's pretend that today you set up a brand new network using Windows Server 2022, and you put all of the security settings in place in your Active Directory according to Microsoft's stated best practices. And let's say that this network became really long-lived, and that by the year 2040, you've done several different upgrades, you've applied each new version of Windows Server as it's come along. In a situation like that, you're probably still going to have some legacy elements that remain in your Active Directory environment. Policies that were put into place when the Active Directory was first created that just kind of hung on. They were overlooked over the years and for whatever reason were never updated. Well, there are a lot of networks that are like that today. Even though they're running current versions of Windows, they still have settings buried in the Active Directory from way, way, way back when, from much earlier versions of Windows. And I've actually run into networks in the real world that still, even though they try to be secure, they still have audit policies that stem from many years ago. So it may be worth taking the time just to simply look at what your audit policies are and make sure that you are auditing what needs to be audited. So how do you do that? Well, at the Active Directory level, all you have to do is go to Computer Configuration, Policies, Windows Settings, Security Settings, Local Policies, Audit Policies. And as you can see in the screen capture, there are several different audit policies that you can turn on and off. So best practice number 5, use very specific security group names. This is one of those best practices that is important, but it can also be somewhat problematic if you've got a really well-established network, because it may mean going ahead and breaking some of what you've already got into place in the interest of achieving better security. So what do I mean by that? Well, a lot of organizations will set up really generic group names, and when those groups are first created, they serve a very specific purpose. But over time, the purpose of those groups evolves, and you can end up with an accumulation of privileges that's tied to that group simply as a result of its name being used for purposes that the group wasn't initially intended. So what do I mean by that? Well, consider your help desk for a moment. Think about all of the things that your help desk does. They probably do password resets. Maybe they establish RDP sessions with Windows clients so that they can resolve problems. And there's probably some other tasks that they do as well. And, it's totally fine if your help desk members have permissions to do all of that because that's part of their job. But think about the permissions that are needed. If you simply created a group called Help Desk and you added permissions every time the help desk ended up needing to do something else, you would end up with one group that has a ton of different permissions assigned to it. And that can present some security risks of its own, and it can end up being a little bit tough to manage from a security standpoint. So a better approach would be to break that out into separate groups. Rather than just having a group called Help Desk, you might have Help Desk Password Reset, Help Desk RDP Logon, and so on and so forth, so that way you have very specific group names with very specific permissions assigned to each individual group related to what that group name is. So going ahead and doing that doesn't really do anything to improve functionality. You're not going to notice much from a functionality standpoint beyond what you've already got. But what it will do is it'll make it really obvious which group does what and what permissions you should expect to see related to that group. So that way, if you end up going in and you do a group security audit, if there's something that doesn't belong there, it'll make it a whole lot easier to spot. Best practice number 6, clean up Active Directory user accounts. This one goes kind of along the same lines as using meaningful group names, but it's a little bit different at the same time. The idea being that one of the more favorite methods that attackers use is looking for accounts that maybe shouldn't be there in the first place. I'm talking about accounts that were created but never actually used, a user never logged on into it, or accounts that belong to a user who no longer works for the company and yet the account remains and the user hasn't logged into it in forever, things like that. And the reason why attackers look for these types of accounts is because it makes it easy to evade detection. Think about it for a moment. If you're an attacker and you're looking to compromise somebody's network and you immediately go after the domain admin account, well, that's going to raise a lot of attention. Hopefully the organization that you're attacking has mechanisms in place to spot security breaches, and any attempts to gain access to the domain admin account are going to raise some red flags, and people are going to take notice. If, on the other hand, you begin your attack by trying to compromise standard user accounts, that's going to be a little bit less noticeable, particularly if you go after accounts that nobody's actually using. So that's one of the favorite methods that attackers use. So as a security best practice, it may be worth your while to go in and look at your Active Directory database and look for accounts that are no longer needed, and then either disable or get rid of those accounts. So how do you go about doing that? Well, there are some really good third-party tools that can help you with that, but you can just as easily do it with PowerShell. So I want to show you a couple of techniques that you can use to go in and find those Active Directory user accounts that are no longer needed. So let's start by doing something easy, taking a look at users who have never logged on. Now, why might this happen? Well, most commonly, an organization will hire a new user. They'll set up an account for that user. And then maybe the day or two before the user is supposed to start their new job, they call the HR department and say, hey, I got a better offer. I'm not coming to work for you after all. And they just move on. But at that point, the account's already been created, and it just kind of slips through the cracks. Nobody ever goes in and deletes that account. So you've got this account that has never been used. So how do you find those? By using this command right here. Get-AD-user is the PowerShell commandlet that retrieves information about Active Directory users. And so after the get-AD-user commandlet, I've got this filter switch. And the filter switch allows us to look for users that fit very specific criteria. So in this case, that filter criteria is last logon timestamp, not like asterisk. So what this means is that when a user logs on to an Active Directory account, there's a parameter, or an attribute rather, associated with that account called last logon timestamp, and it contains a value showing the last time that the user logged on. So what we're doing here is we're checking to make sure that this particular timestamp is not like asterisk. So asterisk is a wildcard. It can be anything. So not like asterisk basically means that this attribute doesn't contain a value, meaning that nobody has ever logged on to this account. So then once we've applied the filter, there's a pipe symbol and then select object name, comma, distinguish name. And all that does for anybody who's not familiar with PowerShell is it causes the get-AD-user commandlet to display the name that's associated with the account. So let's take a look at what this looks like in action. Okay, so if you look at the very top of the slide, you can see the get-AD-user filter command, and then we've got last logon timestamp, not like asterisk. So when I run this command, we get a list of all of the user accounts that have never logged on, and in this particular situation, there's quite a few of them. I set up several accounts just for this purpose. Now, if you look below the list of users who have never logged on, you can see that I entered a second PowerShell commandlet. And this one is almost identical to the first one, but with one minor exception. Instead of using last logon timestamp not like asterisk, I set last logon timestamp like asterisk. And what this does is it returns a list of users who have logged on at some point. So in this case, we've got 2 users who have logged on to this network, and we've got about a dozen users who have never logged on. So what else can we do? Well, another thing that you can do is you can go out and look for user accounts that are disabled. Now, doing this has a couple of useful functions. One is that it can help you to go clean up old user accounts, because it's really common when a user leaves an organization to simply disable that account for a period of time so that the user's data remains, because you never know when a coworker might need something that belonged to that user. So it's easier to leave the account created and just disable it so nobody can log on to it. So that's one thing that this particular command is useful for. Another thing that's useful is that this can help you to just verify your security posture. If you've got certain built-in accounts that you want to be disabled at all times, this gives you a very easy way of verifying that those accounts are still disabled. So how does the command work? Well, it's really similar to what I just showed you on the previous slide. We start with get-AD-user, and again, that's the PowerShell commandlet that's used to return information about an Active Directory user. And then we're using the filter once again, but we're using a different filter. Instead of looking at the last logon timestamp, what we're looking at is whether or not the enabled attribute is set to false. So if the enabled attribute is set to true, that means that the account is enabled. If it's set to false, that means that the account is disabled. And then again, after the filter, I'm using select object name, distinguish name to display the username. And you can see the results of this particular command down below. So in this case, we've got user 4 is disabled. We've got another account, KRBTGT, that's disabled. And then we have a guest account that's disabled. Now, the guest account is disabled by default, and there's really no good reason for enabling this account, which raises the question of why does this account even exist in the first place if it's disabled by default and best practices are not to enable it? Well, this kind of goes back to something that I was talking about earlier when I was talking about that you can have things on your network that stem from ages past but are still present even today. Because back when Windows NT was created, Windows NT Server was not the dominant network operating system. At that point in time, and I'm talking very early 90s, like 1991, 1992, the dominant network operating system was Novell NetWare. And Novell NetWare had a built-in account called Guest that was fairly heavily used. When Microsoft created NT Server, they needed to make it play well with Novell NetWare, because that was the only way that they were going to be able to break into the enterprise networking market, is if it was able to coexist with the products that were already used there. So they designed Windows NT Server to include a guest account that functioned similarly to the way that the NetWare guest account worked. And even all these years later, that guest account remains simply for backward compatibility purposes. So that's why that particular account still exists. Just throwing in there as a matter of trivia. So one more thing that you can do with PowerShell that I want to quickly show you is find users who haven't logged on for a really long time. So let's say you've got a user who has left the organization, their account remains, and nobody's logged on to this account for ages. Well, this is how you would go about finding that account. And I pulled this particular script from the web page that's listed at the bottom of the slide. There are other ways that you do it, but this was one of the simpler ones that I could find. So I'm not going to go through every last part of this commandlet because I've got several other things that I want to get to and I'm running out of time. But the very first line creates a variable called inactive days, and that's set to 90. So as this is written, this is going to look for users who haven't logged on in the last 90 days. You could change the value of that inactive days to whatever you want. So you could change it to look for users who haven't logged on in 30 days, 120 days. It doesn't really matter. But you would set the number of days using this line. So then we have another variable, $days, and what we do is we use the getDate function, which gets the current date, and then we're adding a negative to get what the date was on, or 90 days ago in this particular case. So then we're using getAdUser, and then once again we're setting up a filter, and then all of that stuff that you see after the filter is just date computations. It's a way of looking to find out if the user has logged on after the date that is specified. So best practice number 7, reevaluate your service accounts. And there are numerous best practices related to service accounts. I don't have time to go into this in great detail. But the biggest thing is you want to make sure that you're using managed service accounts instead of user accounts. In the case of your service accounts, if you are using user accounts, make sure that they have strong passwords. Make sure every service account uses a different password. And don't use a service account for more than one purpose. So if you've created a service account, you don't want, and that service account is essentially just a user account, you don't want to use that service account for more than one application. And there are some applications out there that require multiple service accounts. So if you've got an application like that, you want to make sure that you're using a different service account for each one, rather than just using one service account for all of the different functions. Otherwise, you can end up back in that situation where you've got an unhealthy accumulation of privileges going. And then the very last thing on this slide is only use software that works without domain admin permissions. Sadly, even today, there are still some applications out there that won't work unless they have administrative permissions. And as a best practice, you should really look to phase out your use of any applications that require full-blown domain admin permissions. Okay, best practice number 8, establish a security baseline and enforce it. This is another one I'm not going to go into in a great deal of depth because I want to be able to leave a little bit of time to talk about the last best practice on the list. But the basic idea behind this is that you've got some idea of what it means for your network to be secure. So you can actually quantify that and turn that definition of what it means for your network to be secure into what's known as a security baseline. Then once you've got that security baseline, you can test against it and look for any machines that don't live up to your security requirements. And there are any number of different tools out there that you can use to do that. Microsoft has a free tool called the Security and Compliance Toolkit that you can download. You can do that with this. If you're good with PowerShell, there's also the desired state configuration tool that you can use. That's another free tool. And then, of course, there are also plenty of third-party tools out there. Best practice number 9, look for ways in which non-Windows resources can impact Windows security. The basic idea behind this one is that at one point in time, Windows was the only game in town. Applications ran on Windows Server. All of the users worked from carefully curated, domain-joined Windows desktops. But that hasn't been the case for quite some time. A lot of users will work remotely, largely from personal devices, and there are typically also non-Windows machines that are on any network. So the important thing to keep in mind about that is that you may have to maintain parallel security mechanisms, one for the Windows environment and one for non-Windows machines. For example, group policy has long been the go-to security mechanism for Windows environments, but you can't apply group policy settings to non-Windows machines or to Windows machines that aren't joined to your domain. So typically, those same settings that you would normally apply through group policy have to be applied through mobile device management software or through something like that. So the essence of this particular best practice is to look for situations where you've got discrepancies between what you're doing with group policy and what you're doing with your other security mechanisms. And it's also good while you're doing that to take a look at other things that are connected to your network that might undermine your security. For example, let's suppose you've got a really, really secure Windows network, but you've got a managed switch that's set up using a default password. That's a huge security weakness. So even though your Windows network is secure, you've still given the bad actors a way in. So the idea behind this best practice is just to be on the lookout for things like that. Now, best practice number 10, and I think I've got enough time to cover this one adequately, is to reconsider how you're controlling endpoint applications. The idea here is that it's definitely within your best interest to make sure that users aren't able to run any unauthorized code on their Windows desktops, because unauthorized code can cause all kinds of problems for you. Even a benign example is a user might download an application and install it on their system, but you could run into licensing problems, because if that application that the user downloaded is unlicensed and it's installed on one of your desktops, well, you're the one who's on the hook for that. But from a security standpoint, this application might be written poorly. It might contain exploitable vulnerabilities. It might not be patched. Or it could be something malicious. Maybe it contains spyware, or maybe it's ransomware in disguise. Who knows? So it's important to make sure that users aren't able to run unauthorized code on their Windows desktops. Now, there have been third-party tools for preventing that sort of thing for many years, and there are some really good third-party solutions for that. But purely from a Windows standpoint, the go-to tool has always been Windows Application Control. The go-to tool has been AppLocker, which is used for Windows Application Control. The thing about AppLocker is that it can be a little bit messy to set up. The basic AppLocker controls are pretty simple, but you really have to know what you're doing when you're setting up AppLocker, or you can end up in a situation where you leave some big gaping holes unintentionally, or you can lock down something that you hadn't planned on locking down. It can be pretty messy to work with. But Windows 11 does offer some better options. So one of the options that exists in Windows 11 is something called Smart App Control. Smart App Control is a brand new mechanism, and what it does is it maintains a list of trusted applications, and it makes sure that nothing that's untrusted is allowed to run on your Windows 11 desktops. Now, Smart App Control can be extremely effective at preventing users from running unauthorized, or I should say untrusted code, but it's got its good points and it's got its bad points. The good point is that it's effective. It does a really good job. The bad point is that it's very unforgiving and it's very rigid. So, for example, if you've got something that Microsoft trusts, but you don't necessarily want to authorize in your own organization, you can't use Smart App Control to prevent that application from running. Because Microsoft trusts it, it will be allowed to run. There isn't really a way for you to go in and deny access to that application using Smart App Control. You'd have to go back to using something like App Locker. So how do you enable this? Well, right here, we're looking at the settings within Windows 11. And you can see that I'm on the App and Browser Control, and there is an option for Smart App Control. So you would simply click on Smart App Control and then either set it to evaluation mode or turn it on. That's it. This is all the configuration that exists for Smart App Control. Now, I mentioned that Smart App Control had some downsides. The first one being that it's only included with Windows 11 version 22H2, so the one that came out the most recently. Now, the reason why that matters is because let's say you've got an existing Windows 11 desktop and you install Windows 11 22H2. Smart App Control isn't going to be there. It won't even show up on the slide or on the screen that I just showed you within settings. It won't be there. The reason for that is that Smart App Control only appears on brand new Windows 11 22H2 installations. If you've upgraded from another edition of Windows 11, Smart App Control isn't going to be available. If you install 22H2 directly, but you let some time go by, maybe you install some applications, it's probably not going to be there. So it's only going to be available with brand new installations. Now, from a practicality standpoint, in an enterprise environment, what this really means is that if you want to use Smart App Control, you're probably going to have to build a brand new deployment image from scratch. Otherwise, that feature isn't going to be there. Another thing that you need to know about Smart App Control is that, as I said a moment ago, it maintains a list of trusted versus untrusted applications, and it will only authorize a trusted application to run. The problem with that is that if you've got an application that Microsoft doesn't trust, you're not going to be able to run it with Smart App Control enabled. Now, an untrusted application isn't necessarily the same thing as a malicious application. An untrusted application could simply be an application that Microsoft doesn't know about, so they haven't added it to the list of trusted applications, rather. So let me show you what this looks like. So in this case, I ran an application. In this case, it was just DOSBox, which is a DOS emulator that you can run on Windows, and Smart App Control blocked it. You can see what the message looks like right here. So it did its job. But let's say for a moment that DOSBox was something that I wanted to be able to use. Well, you'll notice that there's no way of whitelisting DOSBox. There's simply an OK option. Clicking OK clears the message, but it doesn't allow the application to run. So there's no way of going in and whitelisting an application that you want to allow. So using Smart App Control is all or nothing. You either accept all of Microsoft's restrictions or you have to turn it off. And once you turn it off, and this is another one of those really important takeaways, once you turn it off, there's no way to turn it back on without completely reformatting the machine and reinstalling Windows 11 22H2 from scratch. Now, there are some other mechanisms, and I'm running really tight on time, so I'm going to have to breeze through this. But there are some other mechanisms, one being reputation-based protection. And this is similar to Smart App Control, but not quite as restrictive, and it allows or denies applications based on their reputation. You can see reputation-based protection down at the bottom of this slide. So when you go into reputation-based protection, there are all kinds of different settings that are related to it. For example, phishing protection is turned on by default, and you can see that there's an option that's enabled by default for the phishing protection to warn me about malicious apps and sites. There's another option to warn me about password reuse. So if, for example, a user were to try to reuse their Windows password on a web application or something like that, then they're going to receive a notification telling them that they shouldn't do that. There's also an option for warning the user about unsafe password storage. So if, for example, a user types their Windows password into Notepad, they'll receive a warning message. Now, one thing that I should mention about this is that these warnings go to the user, not to the administrator. So this isn't so much an administrative control as just something to try to keep your users in check. And it's also worth noting that these phishing protection features that mention passwords are only related to the Windows password. So if a user has, say, a web application password and they try to reuse that same web application password with a different web application, they're not going to receive a warning message about that. And then down below that, we have other settings, potentially a wanted application, so you can block the applications, you can block the download of those applications. You can enable or disable Smart Screen for Microsoft Store apps, and there are a few other settings. But that's just a high-level overview of how reputation-based protection works. So with that said, I am just about out of time, but I want to leave just a minute or two here at the end in case anybody in the audience has any questions.
Okay. Well, we do have several questions from the audience, from Timothy, Richard, James, Andrew, Edgar, and more. But we are almost out of time. We have a big session coming up. So, Brian, you get to play Choose the Question. Go to the Q&A box, look through those questions, and choose the one you want to answer because we only have time for one.
Go ahead and give it to me. I don't have it up on screen. I've got the slides full screen.
Okay, then. Let's look through them. You can't open up that little box, huh? Q&A? All right, let's get to a question. What's that?
I was still looking for it.
That's all right.
Go ahead.
Let's get to a question. Early on in your presentation, Edgar asked the question, what if end users need to run updates for things like Java or other apps? What kind of rights and settings need to be made in AD?
In AD, I'm not sure that you would necessarily have to do anything if a user just needed to update Java. Typically, that's something that they would be able to do because Java already has the permissions in place that it needs in order to be able to run already on that machine, so the update process should be tied to those existing permissions. So you should be good to go there. Keeping in mind Java isn't one of those things that I use myself, but that should be the way that that would work.
Okay, that was a quick answer. We have time for another question. When you were talking about laps, the question just disappeared right before my eyes. Okay. Oh, wait, here it is. From James. When you were talking about laps, James said, doesn't laps work against dedicated admin accounts?
Yes, it does, and that's kind of the whole point behind that is that it makes it so that the built-in administrator account on each Windows desktop is treated as dedicated. So the password that's assigned to one isn't going to be the same as the password that's assigned to the next machine. So that way, if somebody happens to compromise one Windows desktop, that compromised account isn't going to be able to be used on another.
Okay, great. Well, it looks like that's all the questions we have time for. So thanks again, Brian, for a great presentation and answering all those questions.